Edmund, the Voyage. His aim never faltered. At the peak of his mighty ship, Edmund stood fierce, with his bow drawn back to his cheek, staring out into the mists of the raging waters beneath the southern storms. Something lingered out in the darkness. He could feel the air bending to the will of whatever it was. Much like his title, he stood far above any of the other men on board. His silent crew, the ones far below that were spread across the deck, each glaring out in the same direction to seek out the hidden stalker of the seas. "Are you sure you saw it, lad?" a harsh-voiced man asked with fury to one of the younger boys, one who shivered from the biting breeze of the southern winds.
"I'm certain of it," the boy protested back through his quivering lips. "I saw the mast out in the fog right there."
Their quarrelling didn't avert Edmund's steady attention to the waves that ascended and fell in his sights, each time taunting him with the possibility of another ship revealing itself to his own. Not a single wince or a blink. His rigid hands holding tightly to his string and grip, the lungs of his crew and his own chest, each frozen in place to let him listen for the spies that lurked through the waters around them.
"The lad might have just seen—"
"Shut it!" Edmund barked down to them from the nest, sensing the lingering threat nearing closer to the Voyage he guarded. A shadow flickered. He saw it. He would swear on the lives of everyone on board that he saw the dark figure of a passing mast in that single second. His grasp tightened, and his arms had yet to suffer a strain or ache. His eyes studied the waves harshly, piercing through the mist that clouded the air and flicking his wet fringe out of sight. The heavy rain and the thundering clouds were the most mischievous of tricksters, but Edmund's own eyes had never once conned him. He trusted only in what he knew he saw in that brief and certain moment. Another vessel was approaching.
"There!"
a voice from below alerted, pointing out the ship that fell with a giant of a wave, one lined with ballistas across its ridge of archers. A swarm of man-sized arrows shot from the giant crossbows the invaders wielded, the same weapons that Edmund's ship was also armed with. They held almost double the amount of their newly found enemies, soon using them to retaliate, filling the cold air with the wicked whistles of their many shooting spears. From above, Edmund rained down havoc onto the crew of the opposing ship. Those who attempted to load the baleful bounds of ballistas once again were soon met with his swiftly fired arrows, each striking them deep into their hearts or throats. No amount of wind, rain, or rum could sway his aim. His ship took damage, suffering at the hands of the giant bows that tore the wood from his deck and struck down his scattering men. Shooting his treasured Voyage was never taken lightly in Edmund's eyes. It was always seen as an enemy's choice to die for their own foolishness of attempting to attack him of all people. That was their own mistake. His quiver grew lighter until no arrows remained. His bow had served as best it could for him, ending the lives of at least 24 of those it shot at.
"Captain!"
a husky voice called through the raging storm and the manic shouts of men. Edmund looked down to the deck, catching the sight of a white-bearded man among the chaos of his hurrying crewmates. Upon sliding down the ladder and narrowly avoiding the many arrows that were shot his way, Edmund dropped to the wet wood of his deck. He shoved his way through the men that were struck down by enemy arrows, or blasted into the sea at the hands of the merciless crew on the opposite side of the untamed waters, before finally colliding with the man he sought.
"What is it, Pete?"
Edmund asked loudly, as he pulled his eldest crewmate behind the second mast that was riddled with arrows, wiping the drenching rain from his brow.
"That ship's the Mad Maiden,"
he called back to him through the thunder, drawing his sight to the belly of the ship that held those infamous words.
"It's robbed almost every fishing village across Sirens Bay. We can't let a ship with that many goods sink, Captain."
A ship stocked full of riches and goods, stolen from a neighbour's docks. It couldn't sink into the undeserving sea they battled on, which meant victory could only be won by one way.
"The ship is no threat to us if all its crew are dead,"
Edmund yelled. He hurried back out onto the bedlam of his deck, pushing his way through the brawny men of his crew, pushing aside their rugged bodies and angered faces. The wounded crouched down for cover from the attack, calling for aid from their brethren as others worked quickly to reload their crossbows and gamble on a good shot. Edmund's legs buckled when his feet struck the planks of his deck that stuck out like pikes upon the damage they had been dealt. He continued to shove through the many bustling souls around him before finally gripping tightly onto the large shoulders of the most fierce man in his company.
"Watch yourself,"
Laurel snapped in a grueling growl. He was more mountain than man. He had a body of rugged rock sealed in his dark, hard skin. Edmund pulled the giant man's head down to make him hear the words of his lips.
"We're not sinking their ship. We're going to take it. Call off the loaders and ready for the grapples."
Laurel scoffed.
"Taking their ship. Let the cunts sink with it and drown."
Edmund yanked him down again, having to lift his heels to even reach his collar.
"Your captain commands it."
After a short-lived moment of swapping deathly glances between each other, Laurel abided, standing tall among all the other heads with his strident voice at the ready.
"Captain's orders. Prepare the grapples and your bows. We're not sending that ship of pirate cunts to the ocean floor. We're taking it home."
Laurel yelled, with his axe lifted high above him. With a half-jolly cheer, half of the crew abandoned their posts on the ridge and hurried down to the lower decks, soon returning with the giant steel grapples that took more than one man on each to handle. Laurel himself could carry his own, holding more muscle than a bear on his towering body. Edmund distanced himself from the line of fire, hurrying to the upper deck to watch the events unfold in front of him. Pete hobbled to his side, readying his crossbow for a possible kill or two. Upon swiftly forming 4 lines along the deck as the enemy continued to shower them with poorly fired arrows, his strongest crewmates lunged the heavy grapples far across the open water that stuck into the ship across from them. They each heaved under Laurel's tyrannical instruction, sticking the sharp teeth of the grapples deep into the wood of the Mad Maiden's tough ridge. As Edmund urged their relentless pulling, he watched as their 2 voyages neared closer together, soon to be locked at each other's side before suffering through a brutal brawl that his crew was so bitterly well known for. Now, the men of those attacking were close enough to have their gazes met, close enough for Edmund to catch the fearful expressions they held as the space between them grew terrifyingly shorter as each swift second passed. The infamous sound of blades being pulled from their sheaths was the sign Edmund had always known. The time for butchery was upon them, as the 2 ships clashed together, hiding away the dark depths of the sea beneath their colliding ridges. What remained of the Mad Maiden's thieving crew were now sprinting across the pierced wood of Edmund's ship, yelling out their curses and cries as they swung their large axes and jabbed with their sharp daggers. It was almost sad for Edmund, knowing that the clueless crew of that ship would suffer at the hands of his own barbaric one. When it came to battles of bows and arrows, only the luck of his men and the will of the wind could decide the fate of his crew. But when the blades were drawn and their opponents met them face to face, Edmund's crew would always win. Always. Swords cut through flesh and bone. Limbs fell to the wood below them in puddles of red as screams howled louder than the storm that caved in around them. The weaker fighters of the pirate crew were no more than toys for his own. Some of his men even abandoned their blades, using only their bare hands to beat and strangle their enemies with joy. They were beyond being called men. The crew of Edmund's ship were monsters, ones wearing masks of skin that hid away their sadistic souls. But when the chance to kill invited them out, their inner demons would always reveal themselves, just as they were doing in those very moments. He studied the men that fought for the failing side, always intrigued by their hopeless actions upon realizing their deaths were seconds away. Some cut their own throats, letting themselves die at their own hands instead of being gutted by a stranger's blade. There were those who begged and pleaded for their lives, falling to their shaking knees and clamping their hands together, praying to their supposed merciful gods to be saved. His crew sliced every beggar down without a second thought. Some, who were cornered, would even stupidly jump from the ship, prolonging their deaths, soon to be killed by the cruel cold of the seas or the teeth of the terrible creatures that roamed the wicked waters. Almost all of the blood that soaked his deck came from the flesh of people he did not know, strangers who were now nothing but limp bodies that were soon to be tossed overboard and forgotten from the world. Some may even get caught in the uncertain tides of the south, doomed to be carried by the seas until they were just another washed-up corpse on one of the islands of Edmund's home. Lifeless corpses for the crabs to feed on. Laurel's axe led the gruesome charge. It raised and fell alongside the waves that it mimicked, each time rising with more blood splattered across its sharp iron edge. The arm of his colossal crewmate did not dither for any amount of pleading pirates or pitiful prayers. It only carved through them with a merciless thirst. What remained of the crew of the Mad Maiden were now running to their lower decks, hiding and squealing as Edmund's crew marched down to them with their bloody blades and even bloodier faces. Despite the heavy wood between those hidden men and the open air outside, their torturous torment could still be heard. It was crafted from their shrill shrieking and harrowing cries for a non-existent mercy. In a time that lived for only a few frightful moments, Edmund listened as their wails, whimpers, and weepings had been brought to silence by the blades of his crew. Soon, it was followed by his men returning from the horror they had left in those lower decks, each of them with blood dripping from their chins and hands. The battle on the sea was won. A swift and vicious victory. Chests, barrels, and overflowing sacks had emerged from the bloody lower decks of the ship they had now claimed, each filled with seemingly endless supplies of the fishing folk and the stolen possessions that once belonged to the robbed innocents of Sirens Bay. His crew burrowed through them like relentless maggots, pulling out things they took for themselves that they showed off to the others, gloating and bragging about their findings. The mounds of coins ran through their fingers, and the jewels were inspected with curious eyes. Before long, the mangled pirate bodies that lay across the deck were hoisted onto the backs of his men before they were thrown into the ravenous water below. They were followed by the severed hands and feet that still dripped with red, surely to soon summon the fanged creatures of the deep that yearned for the taste of flesh. 6 bodies remained. Those who did not fight for the Mad Maiden, but instead for the ship they lay on in that very moment. Each of them bared the enemy's arrows from their chests or skulls that made lucky landings through the storm's heavy winds. They were formally placed shoulder to shoulder at each other's sides as their fellow crewmates stared down at them. With every victory came an inevitable loss. It was an unspoken practice at this point for those on board. They knew exactly what to do when bodies of their own men were laying on the deck. Their blades were lifted slowly above each of their heads, mirroring Edmund's stance as he too raised his weapon into the air and did not utter a word, saluting the fallen men that he had no care for. No tears would ever fall down the cheeks of any of them. The tributes were always short affairs that never held eulogies or a mass amount of mourning. They were dead, and that was the end of it. The bodies of the perished crew were lifted by their arms and ankles as they were carried down to the lower decks, soon to be taken out again when 6 empty holes were dug out ready for them back on land. Edmund would not need to pay his respects any further. It was hardly a custom of his homeland to pray for the dead. Soon, what remained of the bloodbath was only blood itself. The puddles and splatters were left out for the rain to clean. Or, of course, the deck scrubber. A girl. The only girl, in fact, on the voyage. One young, blonde, and so terribly petite. Her name was Elaine. She had always feared stepping out onto the upper deck of the ship, scared of what she might find awaiting for her to scrub away with her dirty rags. There were also the men to be scared of. The horrid men who treated her in unspeakable ways, both above and below deck, whenever the sky turned dark. Her bruises among her pale white skin were the painful proof of it. The crew soon congregated, cheering to another massacre of a victory and chugging their barrels of ale, rum, and stale wine. Edmund drank too, not to commend his men or praise their callous ways, but because that jug of sour and broiling rum was the only way to escape the utter shame and resentment he felt in every single one of them. Their brutality against pirates could be forgiven to a point. Edmund knew more than most that no person would survive the seas they sailed if they didn't have a stomach for seeing violence, and even, at times, committing violent acts themselves. No, it was the joy they had for it, the lust for a good slaughter. And perhaps even worse was the brutality against his deck scrubber that left a foul taste in his mouth and an undying amount of disgust in them. Their acts would forever be unjustified, but also grievously unconfronted. He had never faced them for the things they had done to her, for he could never bring himself to do it for many unspeakable reasons.
"These lot will be drinking all night,"
Pete said in a scratchy voice, hobbling over to Edmund's side on his crooked legs.
"And singing,"
Edmund sighed.
"They'll chant every song of the South before dawn. God's help us."
The two of them navigated the deck, studying the ridge of his ship that had taken a few lethal hits from the enemy. Edmund stroked his hand along the strong wood that was now mutilated by gashes and pierced by mighty arrows. It was a sorrowful sight to see his Voyage so wounded, as if it were a child of his that he had sworn to keep safe on the water.
"Pirate pricks,"
Edmund uttered beneath his breath, brushing away the splinters of the damaged wood.
"I want the ship's repairs to begin immediately when we dock."
Pete nodded his head.
"Yes, my lord,"
he spoke before swiftly raising his hand, correcting himself with a single word.
"Captain."
Edmund hated the title, the one he shared with his father back home. On the seas, he wished to be seen as a man, with no land to his name, or riches to return to. He was their captain, and nothing more whenever the ship he stood on had its sails raised.
"And make sure those goods are sent back to the villages they were stolen from. This crew has never pillaged before, and I don't want us starting now."
Pete stared blankly at him.
"You must be joking."
Edmund didn't shift his expression, continuing to stand still as he waited for his crewmate to oblige his order. Upon a long and frustrated exhale, Pete flagged down the giant that marched across the deck with the stolen jewels of Siren's Bay still flicking between his knuckles. Laurel leaned his head down to Pete's chalked beard, almost kneeling, hearing his captain's orders being retold and turning his face into the purest of scorn.
"You can't be serious,"
he said coldly, sulking at Edmund's unchanging gaze.
"Your men fight for you, some of them even die for you, and now you won't allow them a reward for their victory. Captain, this is horse shit." "By order of your captain!"
Edmund hissed back, with tightened lips, meeting his furious eyes that narrowed in anger. Eventually, he watched Laurel stomp away in a fit of rage, swatting the skulls of the men who were skulking through the chests and barrels, all the while spreading the news of their captain's new command. In time, each of the men's faces turned his way with disdain, spitting to the wood or muttering their foul curses at the sight of him. Laurel's fiery glare burned the brightest.
"Sometimes I think you're too soft for these seas, lad,"
Pete claimed, placing his plump hand onto his shoulder.
"But any man who can give orders to a beast of a man like Laurel, well, there is a man that must have some of the biggest balls in the South."
Laurel was certainly a beast, not simply just for his great height of brutish strength. His love for torment was what solidified such a label, one that he displayed carelessly whenever he was challenged or given the chance to start gutting pirate folk. Edmund could not keep up with the countless times a member of his crew was beaten senselessly, all because of their own mistakes they made in the presence of Laurel. His deck was almost a traditional site for broken noses and shattered ribs, each time brought about by the unpredictable outbursts of that towering giant fool. Like most grudges among his crew, the group of men soon forgot of their short-lived hatred for the captain, with the help of their own barrels of sour ale, of course, overflowing from the cups that they drank through tirelessly as they skipped and pranced around to the songs they chanted. Many were linked in arms, while others let their drunken feet struggle beneath them to keep them barely standing at all. Edmund watched Elaine, of all people, spotting her in the centre of the ring of dancers, scrubbing harshly at the pirate blood before it dried, as the clouds began to thin out. Her small fingers were soon trampled on by the heavy men around her that were careless in their steps, laughing at her tiny squeals when their heels cracked her fingers. Amid his pitiful prayers for the girl, there came a noise, a kind of coughing, one a fair distance from himself and his singing crewmates. He turned his head, following the sound of a shivering chest until he reached his head over the edge of his ship, staring down into a pair of frightened blue eyes. A boy, one much younger than himself. They were holding tightly to the ropes that ran along the belly of his ship, quivering from the icy cold of the waves that spat at them every few seconds. The boy held out his bare hand upon seeing Edmund's face looking down at him with sullen eyes, silently pleading for him to be quiet. An intruder, one Edmund did not know and certainly did not trust. Without a second thought, Edmund grasped the shaking hand and yanked the boy hard by his arm, slamming him onto the sodden deck to let him scamper across the wood in a panic. The drunken men stopped in the chugging contests, turning toward the newly boarded soul that ignited a silence among them. The frigid boy could hardly speak through his trembling lips. "Don't kill me," he stuttered, begging in a soft and croaky voice. "I never wanted to join the crew, ever. It was either that or starve. I swear it, I do." From the crowd of men, Laurel loomed forward, casting a wide shadow over the body of the young boy in the moonlight as the skies cleared. "Well," he announced menacingly in his voice that would always plague the air, "it would be wrong for us to celebrate a victory against an enemy crew if we haven't entirely won one. I, for one, do not count those victories unless all of them are dead." He soon pulled out a small blade from his buckle, sending the boy scurrying across the deck, pathetically on his hands and knees amid the crew's evil laughter. "Put away the dagger," Edmund told him, shifting Laurel's cruel face into one of disbelief. "It's already been won. If you truly think this young lad is a threat to us, then you really must be a fucking idiot." Laurel huffed with a malice expression. "You would let this tiny prick live." "I'll make that decision when we dock in Braille," Edmund growled. "For now, I want him restrained. That is an order, if you didn't already know." Laurel's reignited fury matched those around him. The crew gritted their teeth at yet another one of Edmund's choices before they fetched the rope, tossing it into Laurel's arms before he marched toward the trembling boy. In a forceful sulk, Laurel dragged the boy across the deck by his collar before slamming his body against the mast, letting him wince in pain as he wrapped the rope tightly around him. He pulled on it harshly a few times, not stopping until the young lad's breath was a struggle for him to squeeze out from his suffocating lungs. Laurel grimaced before leaning close to the boy's ear. "Your friends on that ship screamed like little girls when I killed them," he whispered with a sick smirk. "You will too, soon enough." The boy was left alone upon being given those horrid parting words, bound and terrified as he watched the men soon resume their drinking games and childish chantings. "Thank you," the boy uttered once everyone but Edmund was far enough to not hear his words. He looked up with fear smeared across his face before bowing his head. "You're the captain of the ship, aren't you? I know this ship. It's the Tide Rider." "You should stay quiet," Edmund interrupted. "Don't draw attention your way, and they won't bother you." "If you're the captain, that makes you Edmund Saltspear," the boy continued, almost sounding hopeful in his words. "You can have me sent back to the mainland when we dock, can't you? You're a lord. They'll have to listen to you, yes? They'll kill me if you don't say anything." "I already told you. They won't kill you. They will do as I say because I'm their captain, not their lord. Just keep your mouth shut and try and sleep if you can. We'll be docking on Braille's shores at dawn." The boy did not look entirely trusting, but he still nodded and slumped his body back down against the mast, still shivering. "Thank you, my lord," he said in a soft voice. "My name is Squill, my lord. Squill Mulk, from Haketown." "I don't care who you are or where your home is," Edmund responded with a bleak bluntness. "I just want you to be off my ship and on your way back to wherever it is you came from." Edmund left their talk as it was, a trading of very few words with no rapport made of any kind. At times, he certainly questioned the mercy he gave to certain people, how it might be seen as a weakness of his to his crew, or if it might just be a weakness altogether. The Salt Spear name was known for everything but weakness, but honouring his historic heritage of brutish violence was no concern to him at all. Edmund approached the door of his cabin, not offering so much as a glimpse to his drunken crew on the other side of the deck. Instead, he entered and slammed the door shut behind him, hoping to rid his ears of the many more songs and laughter that were certain to continue through the entire night. There was hardly any use in attempting to sleep so early, not with the noises that loomed outside on the deck. His solitude left him at his desk, overlooking the map of the south that had the path of his ship laid out across it, the one he had been travelling along for many months prior. From the outskirts of the Jade Valley to Gale and across Siren's Bay, the trip had succeeded in doing what he wanted it to do, at least for some time. Forgetting about his life on land. That was its purpose, nothing more. And now, home was the final place his voyage would dock, a place he would one day rule, and a place that held such horrid memories from his youth. Time passed by painfully. The crew had not quietened in the slightest, nor did they give up on their southern songs that they each sang with such aggravating joy, all the while emptying yet another barrel of cheap ale. He studied the spines of the books on his shelves that he had never read, the ones he had collected from the many markets he had visited on his travels across the southern coasts and seaside villages, knowing his brother would be grateful for them upon his return. He sat back down to his desk to look through his new bevy of arrows that were still as sharp as the day he bought them, surely capable of piercing the flesh of any unwise fools that turned their blades toward the Tide Rider. Turning to his right, he caught sight of his own face staring back at him in his crooked mirror. The seas had certainly taken their toll on him, or it may have just been the dark brown hair that grew rough on his head and face. It would always turn curly when it grew long enough, hiding his green eyes with an unkempt fringe. The door of his cabin had suddenly burst open, with two chuckling men stumbling inside, holding poor Elaine between them by both of her slender arms. She was trembling. Roan and Eric, the youngest and loudest lads on his ship that were forever forcing their way into Elaine's company, as well as daring other crewmates to chugging entire jugs in one stretch of gulpings. "What is this?" Edmund questioned the two of them as he rolled the map away, meeting Elaine's wilting eyes. "If you caught her stealing, you can take her to Pete instead. I don't handle such matters," he told them as he leaned back to escape their harsh breaths of ale. No, nothing like that," Eric smirked wickedly. "We assumed that after winning another victory, our captain might want to have a nice, long, and well-deserved fuck with this one in celebration," Roan told him with a menacing glare. "You shouldn't have to sit in your cabin tugging on your cock when you've got a half-decent-looking girl just outside, should you?" The two men gripped at her rags and tore them harshly from Elaine's collar, revealing every inch of her skinny and slight body to him, a body she covered with her arms. Eric pushed her forward, and she collided with the desk Edmund sat at, bending over it in silent prayer. "I know she's not much of a looker," Eric added, "but I can promise that you won't get much better back home, Captain. Braille is a nesting ground for those grisly-looking pigs." Edmund looked deep into her blue eyes that he had seen far too many times before. They were in times exactly like the one they found themselves in. Elaine looked at him, almost unsurprised, as he leaned in close to her ear, ready to mutter something similar to what he had usually said when her predators tried involving him in their horrid business with her. He whispered his infamous words of advice that he despised giving. "They're drunk. Show them a good time, and they'll be finished before you know it," he informed her, holding her hand for a brief moment before standing from his chair. Her eyes turned shallow in deceit. "I'd much rather have her in my chambers back home, not here with the lot of you outside staring in through the glass," Edmund told the two of them, knowing exactly what would come after. "I'll be up in the nest, if that's all." "Well, if you won't take her tonight, I'll assume that means she's free for the two of us,"
We'd love to break in that bed of yours you never sleep in, Captain.
Their voices were slurred, compliments of the cheap ale of Gale's markets. Edmund heard the solemn collapse of Elaine's stomach as he didn't turn away from the door, and as his feet never slowed down or stopped in place until he was back outside on his deck. Every part of him wanted to march back inside and put an arrow in each of their eyes, but he just couldn't. He never ever could. The sea had been tamed, despite the dreadful singing of his crew that had tortured his ears and perhaps the gods too. They had finally escaped the monstrous waves and winds that they left behind further up north that was infamously known for them. Tomorrow would be the day he returned to his dull home. He could already see the distant grey shores of Yark through the thinning mist, the most northern island of the six. Edmund rubbed at his arms as the vicious cold air swarmed him, heading for the only place left on the ship that he could be alone for the night without suffering a confrontation. The crow's nest was not an ideal place to escape the daunting cold or the terrible chance of his crew, but it was the furthest he could get from the lot of them, being among the clouded fog instead. He looked to his right over the battered ridge and toward their fellow ship that once held a throng of pirates across its deck. Now, the Mad Maiden was sailed by his own crew, soon to be the next stolen ship to join the dozens he had back home along the docks of his shores. As he approached the foot of the mast, his heel struck something that yelped. He looked down, only to be reminded of the boy that he had ordered to be restrained there. His body was a shivering mess, and his face was being stripped of all colour, looking up to Edmund with a desperate and suffering expression.
"Can I have something to drink, my lord?"
the boy asked, stuttering from his bluish mouth. The thought of letting the boy suffer quenching thirst through the night had crossed his mind, but before long Edmund found himself fetching one of the half-empty jugs that sat on one of the many barrels. He held it to their lips. The boy took a few sips before retreating his burning throat.
"Gods, that's horrible!"
"It's ale," Edmund replied.
"Not much else to have on this ship. Now drink it or don't drink at all. It'll warm you at the least."
They soon obliged, pulling a sour face as they finished what was left of the stale ale and shook at its vile bitterness.
"They're watching you,"
they said between their coughing. Edmund spied from the corner of his eye, spotting the other men staring their way as their captain aided the stranger on their deck.
"And that's all they'll do. They don't take too kindly to pirates who shoot at their ship. But, as I said, no harm will come to you." "I'm not a pirate. I already told you. I didn't want to be on that ship."
The nest was calling to him again, eager to free him from the new song that unfolded across the deck.
"Some of them came over to me while you were in your cabin,"
the boy continued.
"They said they were going to cut me into pieces and feed me to the sharks or put my head on a spike. And yet here you are, not sliced into pieces and still with your head on your shoulders. They will make false threats and try to make you afraid, but they won't disobey the orders of their captain. Now sleep. You'll be back on your way to Haketown by tomorrow." "Have you been to my home, my lord?"
they quickly asked, as Edmund placed his foot on the ladder, almost as if he was scared to be left alone. Edmund sighed.
"A few times. The lads here are fond of the dock markets." "My mother works there, on the stall with the salted squid legs."
The face of the boy bowed at the mention of his mother back at home.
"You'll see your mother soon, Squill," Edmund said. "And when you return to Haketown, don't ever come this far east again, or you'll join your friends at the seabed." "Yes, my lord,"
Squill stuttered. He caught a glimpse of the boy's shallow smile before he ascended up the wet ladder. Climbing up to the nest that sat in the passing mist, he listened to the shrinking sounds of the water below and the southern songs that were being sung, happy to be at least a short distance from all of it. Hoisting himself up and standing beneath the flailing green flag at the peak of his ship, Edmund looked back north at the storm they had parted from that still let out its mighty roars across the sea. Beneath him was a mound of wet, knotted rope and netting that he had soon laid his head on, facing upwards to the clouds and thinking over his approaching reunion with what was left of his family. He closed his eyes, preparing to soon open them once again to be surrounded by the familiar waters of home.